words. Something, something, something. It may seem as if when I came to write this sermon, I couldn't remember what the title was. But I knew it was something. But something, that word has emerged for me as one of the most fundamental and vital terms to have made its way into my personal spiritual journey. After this sermon, the term something may catch your attention often, as it has mine, for in our language it stands in place when other words fail us or seem inadequate. The dictionary's simple definition of the word is a description that is not exact or of what you are not certain. Something. Think of Robert Frost's poem, "Something there is that does not love a wall that would have it down." In a recent interview, the biographer Walter Isaacson recalled his family's long friendship with the novelist Walker Percy, one of my favorites. Well, Isaac said that he was not really clear about exactly what it was that Uncle Percy did. Not until Percy's marvelous novel, The Moviegoer, was published. And then Isaacson had a heart-to-heart talk with him about what he should do with his life. Percy was clear with his advice. He said, "You could be a storyteller, or you could be a preacher." "Oh God," thought Isaacson, "let me be a storyteller. There are too many preachers in the world already." Well, I actually became a part of that surplus. Some years before I began my recently completed 50 years of Unitarian Universalist ministry, I had a license to preach in the Methodist Church. And I delivered my first sermon at the age of 18. And by the time I graduated from a Baptist college, I was not, if not a fundamentalist, I was at least a conservative, Bible-believing Christian. I was raised by parents in England who were totally indifferent, like most English people, to church and religion. My religious education was left to my sainted grandmother, who was a Jehovah's Witness. And when it came time to decide upon a path, it seemed my calling was either to come from Lord Laurence Olivier's inspiration and the theatre, or the Methodist Bishop of New England. I had no one the like of Uncle Percy, but there were a few to help me narrow down the choice. The bishop got me and appointed me to attend Bangor Theological Seminary and to serve a cluster of 3 small churches in northern Maine in the federally designated economic disaster area of Washington County. Well, as I say, up to that point, I was by no means a fundamentalist. But I was at home in the faith, which is to say that I gave no more thought to credibility of dogma or doctrine than the average Christian does. And so my family and I packed up the station wagon and tied it to the U-Haul trailer and headed from Massachusetts to that economic disaster area in the wilds of Maine. Well, after a long, stressful trip with 2 toddlers near total breakdown, we pulled into the driveway of the parsonage. In those days, most Methodist ministers lived in parsonages. Oh, we left the car and the trailer full of our worldly possessions, and we had a quick meal and a house tour by two ladies of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and collapsed into thoughtfully made-up beds. The beds and all in the parsonages were furnished, and were furnished in what Unitarian ministers referred to as the style of other people's attic. Now, it seemed as if I had no sooner closed my eyes than I was jolted out of sleep by a banging on the kitchen door. Managing to find the kitchen door by the insistent knocking, I met there with an earnest but unapologetic man. "You the preacher?" "Yes, sir." "Preacher down from Bangor. Ain't coming. Sick. We need you to come over and give a service." Well, I had noticed that the little church was across the street from the parsonage, and there was no way that I could begin this country ministry by telling this man that he had to be kidding. So I threw on my Methodist black suit and matching black tie and went out into the driveway and opened the back of the U-Haul trailer, where thankfully right at the back of the trailer was the cardboard box full of sermon manuscripts. Well, I tore open the box, I flipped through the folders, and I spotted one folder marked, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Well, that would do. So I took it, I went across the street, walked into the back of the church, and down front of the church was an arch that spanned the width of the church. It featured a piano, an antique pump organ, and a pulpit. And the arch above all of that was decorated in mosaic from end to end, a mosaic lettering. And the mosaic declared the words, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now you can calculate the odds of that. For me, it was the first non-rational encounter of my life. The odds of the synchronicity being simply beyond reason. At that time of my religious life, there could be no explanation for that synchronicity other than that the union of that congregation and me had been preordained and destined by the divine. No serious Christian would have thought otherwise. I had no reason and no means to think otherwise, and I still have not. Now, with my calling so affirmed and sealed, I dove into the routines and rituals of a Christian minister. I went to school on weekdays down in Bangor, and on Sundays I made the rounds of my 3 little churches, leading them in reciting the Apostles' Creed, following the Methodist ritual for Holy Communion, preaching the Easter Gospel of the Immaculately Born, and at Easter, the saving sacrifice and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, my seminary in Bangor was one of the oldest in the country, second only to Princeton. It was built in 1812, founded by the Presbyterians. It sat high on a hill in Bangor, and it was a slippery slope. I've thought ever since that there is nothing like a good seminary to destroy a person's faith. What biblical and gospel convictions I had came apart piece by piece, course by course. The Word of God was transformed into an interesting but largely irrelevant collection of myths, mistakes, and fabulous inventions. And since the dogma, doctrines, and declarations of Judeo-Christian faith are grounded in that collection of ancient documents, the ground of it all gradually shifted and slipped away. Now, like most of my classmates at that very liberal seminary, I clung to it all as long as I could. But I had morphed from a true believer to a place somewhere between skeptic and out-and-out atheist. Now, that's a sticky place for a ministry student to be. We students justified ourselves by adopting wholeheartedly the liberal academic position that all that dogma and doctrine, scriptures and creeds, all that was allegory, metaphor, and poetry. Now, perhaps needless to say, we kept those academic pretensions to ourselves and did not confuse our congregations with them. But many of us could not maintain the play indefinitely. Before my last year of seminary, I looked around for a way out of a place in the vocation that I could no longer justify. At seminary, a young visiting professor from Columbia often welcomed students to his little room in the seminary for chats, for illegal substances, and for cheap wine that came in potentially straw baskets. I brought the agony of my indecision to his den of iniquity. After a while, I was sufficiently loosened up to risk the declaration, "Frank, I'm about to graduate from seminary, and I don't believe in God." Well, he chuckled, and then he said, "Now you can become a theologian." Well, the idols had fallen, and with the field open, one could indeed become a theologian. I don't know about theologian, but at least my now admitted atheism had freed me from the Bishop of New England and Methodism. You know, when Charles Darwin decided to marry Emma Wedgwood of the Wedgwood family, his father lightly cautioned his son by saying, "You know, Emma and her family are Unitarians." And then he told Charles that the Unitarians perform the function of providing a mattress for the Baptists to land on when they fell. You can pass that on to your sister. Well, I left the Methodists, and I did indeed fall on the Unitarians, leaving behind Bishop, Bible, creeds, virgin births, and resurrections, and I hitched my wagon to the church, which seemed devoid of any blatantly theological commitment and welcomed unbelievers with open arms. But what of my gospel sermon and the miracle of the mosaic? I could no longer accept it as God's blessing on my calling, if I ever did, but neither could I dispose of it in any rational way. So eventually the event stood as a given, as something that happened in my life to which there was and is no accounting. In our Western Judeo-Christian culture, we dwell in a sea of common and largely unquestioned beliefs. If they experience them, most people will ascribe awesome, mysterious, and even horrible events to some understanding of a supernatural power, even if that power grants no explanation for the event. It's estimated in several surveys of religious belief that about 75% of Americans believe that Jesus was resurrected bodily from the dead. And how many people believe that God caused the Holocaust for his own good reason, or the drowning of hundreds of children in a sinking ferry, or the death by illness or accident of a loved one? For most people, God is the explanation for the disasters and the derailments of daily life. It's called God's will. And the silence of God about his will is addressed in 1,000 sermons, most of which seem to end, in effect, with the declaration that the why is none of your business. Some will accept that God need not explain his mysterious ways. They can be convinced that God took little Susie because he wanted her for an angel, and lie then quivering under any number of blows from an angry and selfish God. Even Jesus is said to have cried into the silence from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Silence. Still, all that is grist for the mill to those who will have no part of the silence, who will take no comfort in that incomprehensible divine, no trembling in the awesome splendor of the destroyer, and they are the atheists. Dawson and the late Christopher Hitchens have perhaps popularized atheism, but they are by no means newcomers with the message that God is not great and simply that God is not. In the 19th century, there was a famous orator but largely now forgotten, Robert Ingersoll. In the 1960s, there was Madeleine O'Hare, and just a few decades ago in Atlanta, two Emory professor theologians proclaimed that God was dead. You would think, as professors, they would have read Nietzsche before that, but it does often seem that contemporary atheists are more passionate in their unbelief, more ardent and fervid in their pronouncements. The evangelists for atheism often seem to me to be as eager to convert believers to atheism as the believers are to convert the faithless to faith. One contemporary atheist, who is, however, more on the side of caution, is the prolific author and polymath Dr. Barbara Ehrenreich. Her most recent book is called To a Wild God. Ehrenreich was a child prodigy of brilliant, if dissolute, atheists. She nurtured her inherent atheism and skepticism and her incredulity about everything but pure empiricism until in her adolescence, on a school trip with friends, she wandered off a little apart by herself and had a remarkable experience that turned the course of her life and understanding. She suddenly experienced herself as the center of a powerful force rooting her to the spot on which she stood, and everything around her bathed but not consumed in fire. This was a woman with 2 PhDs and a science career. In a few moments, that experience was over, and she returned to her friends, shaken and trembling, but silent about the happening. She writes, "So what do you do with something like that? An experience so disconnected from normal life that you can't even figure out how to talk about it. If you tried to explain such an experience," she writes, "you might get the same response you would if you confided that you had been a victim of an alien abduction." But she writes in what I think is the definitive sentence of her book. She writes, "I had seen what I had seen, and I had heard what I had heard. Whatever it is that flies under the named world, and I was not going to deny its existence." So that statement capsulizes where I have found myself in what I think of as my own spiritual journey. Yeah, I would be presumptuous to call it an evolution from atheism into the presence of and occasionally in confrontation with, not God, but something more that must be embraced as part of the reality of world and self, or simply denied out of hand, or referred to the rationalism of science and psychiatry. I came to the realization through my own extraordinary experiences that what it means to be religious does not have to do with whether or not one believes in God or the gods or the creeds of religion. The non-religious assumption, as I read from Dduuc earlier, the non-religious assumption is that any awesome, extraordinary event we may experience is a confrontation with something within ourselves, perhaps some neurological aberration to be cured by a pill or by a practitioner. Or as Ebenezer Scrooge attempted to comfort himself by describing a ghost as perhaps an undigested bit of beef. But as Hamlet said to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. I've come to believe that to be religious is to be open to the extraordinary, to the wondrous, to the captivating, to the awesome, open to the shaking of the foundations of our assumptions, awake and accepting of that something of the full reality of our world and our existence in it. The poet Wendell Berry has written, "The mind that is not baffled is not occupied." My young mentor in seminary was right. When I declared myself an atheist, I began to become religious. Black Elk said of his famous vision, "And while I stood there, I saw more than I could tell, and I understood more than I saw, for I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the Spirit, and the shape of all things as they must live together, like one being." And by the way, the Plains Indian term for God is Wakantanka, and that can be loosely translated as the great something. On a sabbatical in Arizona, I came under the guidance of a medicine man and professor and attorney, all rolled into one. And he ordained me, after months of relationship, he ordained me as eagle. And hiking a desert mountain one day, I heard the affirming and confirming, whispering blessing of a circling eagle. And revisiting a winter empty beach in Cornwall, England, after many years of having played on that same beach as a child, then among the still standing tank traps and barbed wire, and as I walked in whatever state of mind, I encountered a small boy building a castle in the sand against a Norman or invading Hun, invading from the sea. We stared at each other in mutual recognition. Past and future, in time present, as Eliot wrote. Something foretold and something remembered. And one night, as I climbed into bed and picked up my book, a clear but unfamiliar male voice to my right said, "There are 5 human wounds, the first of which is birth." Well, of course, part of me immediately sprang to a published book, and I waited eagerly for the rest of the human wounds, but they never came. That was part of the experience. Well, say what you will of these non-rational events. No, there was no alien abduction. There was no neurological aberration. There was no recurring psychotic incident. But I saw what I saw, and I heard what I heard. It was something. So how do we live? How might we live in a world of encounters with inexplicable happenings without explanation? The amazing Peter Matheson died in past April at the age of 86. He had written The Snow Leopard, A Play in the Fields of the Lord, and shelves of other fiction and non-fiction. But his last book, published shortly before he died, is called In Paradise. The story of his novel is set in Auschwitz, with a cast of characters, contemporary characters, at a retreat in the post-war death camp. The retreat participants sat all day in silent meditation on the train platforms where the people had been sorted out for slave labor or death. One night, in the midst of the quiet discussion of the day, the group suddenly got to their feet and began dancing on that platform. An event that was deeply moving for some, Matheson writes, and was outrageous for others. In an interview about this remarkable book, Matheson refers to a poem by Anna Akhmatova, which is the epigraph, I believe, to his novel. The poem visits the dancing on the platform of Nightmare and asks, how could it happen to dance while we are surrounded by so much death? Why then do we not despair? Unable to name that, which brought those people to their feet in Auschwitz, to dance in a celebration of life, Matheson answers the poem's essential question: how do we despair without God? By striking his leg in time, as he said, something, something, something. If you will now, as you are willing and able, to stand and sing